Hello, it's Dane here from the Oxford Science and Ideas Festival, and it's a pleasure to be part of this event tonight on a complex topic with a equally complex social story behind it. I want to alert you that there are some challenging themes that come up in this, so just be prepared for that. The film itself is also quite brutal in some ways. So if you are prone to flashing lights causing a problem or abrupt sounds making you feel agitated, please just maybe mute the audio on your device, or maybe look away from the camera if the flashing lights are getting to you. I will suggest, though, for the best viewing experience, to turn the volume up to a level that's comfortable and slightly louder than you might enjoy. It's up to you, though. And if you turn the lights down low for the greatest effect. But again, those video settings and room settings are entirely up to you. So the way that the event tonight is going to work is we're going to show a film and then have a discussion about how it was made, why it was made, and some of the issues that the film kind of brings to light. So we have a panel of 3 people. So maybe if we can just show ourselves very briefly, to show that there are real people. I always like to see the real people before we show a cultural product that we've made. So here we've got Charles, who was an English student at Somerville College, Oxford, and he's worked on several short films and some feature films, and won the Film Foundation summer competition for a documentary on St. Petersburg. And Charles is going to be talking about the making of the film that we're going to see tonight. So if you want to just say hello, Charles, so we can just spotlight you for a second. Next up, we have Josh, who studies politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford, and he has been involved with film production in the UK and Australia, working on features and commercial films, and he's now doing a master's at UCL on filmmaking. So if you could just say hi, thank you. And then we have Pete, who is president of the Society for Radiological Protection and has about a dozen years' experience working on nuclear power and contaminated land sites. So Pete, if you could just say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. So these guys are going to come back in a second. So the film tonight, Charles, Josh, and a couple of their friends made while on a trip across Russia, which is a fun thing to do. And the intention was to make a film about brutalist architecture. And with every good story, there is a significant plot twist. And so that film was not made, and instead the film you're about to see was made. So the first few seconds of the film, so 20 seconds or so, there is no sound and there's odd noises, which is the familiar sound of a Geiger counter. That is what it's supposed to be. So sit back and get the sound at a comfortable level and the lighting at a comfortable level, and enjoy the film, which is going to be played for you in a moment. Well, a powerful film, some really quite powerful themes. So, Charles, my first response is why?
Shall I talk a bit about how it came about?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to put up. So we didn't intend to make this exact film about nuclear testing in the former Soviet Union. In fact, we intended to make quite a different film. So last summer, the summer of 2019, me and 3 other friends were fortunate to be awarded Margaret Thatcher scholarships from Somerville College to make a documentary about brutalism across Europe and the former Soviet, across Europe and the former Soviet Union, including Central Asia. So we hope to drive all the way from the southeast of England to Mongolia in this car. As you may or may not know, there are many great examples of brutalism in Central Asia and in Europe, but it's not a hugely popular form of architecture. And so many of the buildings that we hope to see were either at risk of demolition or actually scheduled to be demolished. And so we saw this documentary we were going to make as a really important way of documenting buildings that may not be around for that much longer. And we're still putting together the brutalism film at the moment. This is Gen X Tower in Belgrade, which is one of the most famous brutalist buildings in the world. Unfortunately, it's not one of those that's under threat. So this was our intended route. It was basically dictated by brutalist landmarks, but we also picked some cities and geographical regions that we were particularly interested in. So we wanted to drive through Europe, through Turkey, take a ferry across the Caspian Sea, drive through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, then do the Pamir Highway, which is around here, head north through Kazakhstan before moving into Russia and finally Mongolia. And then we'd finish after about 7 weeks in Ulan-Ude in Russia, which is just north of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Unfortunately, the trip did not go exactly as expected. This was pretty early on, about 9 days in Bulgaria, a few miles away from the Turkish border. We had a car crash and no one was hurt, but our car was written off and unable to drive any further. So we were stuck at this point. We had all our documentary film equipment, a desperate desire to put together this documentary, and plenty of time, but no car. However, the Bulgarian mechanics who were scrapping our Skoda just so happened to have a 2003 Mercedes-Benz for sale at what seemed a bizarrely good price. We were so delighted by this idea of being able to continue our trip in a safer, newer car that we didn't question some of the aspects of the deal that perhaps we should have. We didn't, for example, question the fact that they asked us to pay it entirely in cash, nor did we question the fact that according to the documentation of the vehicle, it was registered to an owner in Cambridge, and yet this man spoke no English at all. This was 24 hours after we bought the car. We were sold a dud. We were told that it would cost up to £3,000 to fix as it spluttered to a halt as we crossed the border into Turkey. At this point, we were pretty close to going home. I remember looking at flights from Istanbul. Josh, however, found a friend in Georgia who told us that in Georgia it was particularly easy to buy cars. It was particularly inexpensive and there wasn't a huge amount of paperwork. So we took a bus from Ankara to Tbilisi, where we bought our third car. And so this is actually the car that you would have seen in the film, and it's the car that got us all the way to Mongolia. But it was rough. I mean, a lot of the time we were driving on either very bad roads or very rough roads. And so we had to replace almost everything in this car, from the clutch to the wheels to the suspension. But eventually we did make it to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan was somewhere that was on our list, less because of any brutalist landmarks and more because we'd heard incredible things about the natural scenery. This is the Karzai Lake near Almaty, where we camped on our first night in the country. The other thing that we noticed as soon as we got into Kazakhstan was how good the roads were. In Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, we'd become used to driving on roads riddled with potholes. And so it was pretty exciting to be able to drive on some smoother roads. However, we kind of spoke too soon, because as we pulled out of Almaty, the new road quickly petered out, and we got onto the worst road we'd been on for the entirety of our trip. We were basically limited to about 30 or 40 miles an hour, driving all the way up the length of Kazakhstan. And so we were looking for things to do in the car. We were basically driving 10-hour days. We were looking for ways to fill our time. So we basically ran out of all the music that we'd listened to, but we did have a copy of the Lonely Planet guide that Josh was very fond of. And we ended up reading that basically from cover to cover. And during that reading, we discovered that we were close to the Soviet nuclear testing site near Semi. And so, although we'd been aware of nuclear testing, we weren't aware of how close we were going to be. And when we found that out, we really wanted to go visit and find out a bit more. So the testing site is indicated there in orange, and we were already heading to Semi. So it seemed like too good an opportunity not to go and visit. This map shows quite a useful kind of how close Semi is to the test site. And when we were in Semi, we inquired about guided tours of the test site, but learned that they only went every 3 days or something, and we didn't have 3 days to wait because of the various car calamities that we had on our way. But we were told we could go as far as Chagan in the car on our own. So that's what we did. We drove from Semi to Chagan, which is here, and that drive took us about an hour. We saw no other vehicles on this stretch of road. At one point, we did stop at a level crossing where there was a kind of flashing red bulb, and this freight train rumbled past. But then we were just again left entirely to ourselves, and it was quite unnerving heading to this kind of abandoned or semi-abandoned area. And so this is Chagan, which you've seen from from the film. We knew from our reading that this was a town that had housed the Soviet pilots who had dropped the nuclear test bombs until they'd left in 1995. But it was an eerie space. We didn't see anybody here, but then we heard a human voice. And at first we wondered if this was some kind of presence from the past, but then we realized it was just a man herding his goats. I think that although we knew very little about the Soviet testing program still at this point, that the atmosphere here acted as a prompt for us to investigate much more. Although Chagan housed the pilots rather than those that were indirectly bombed, it became this visual metaphor for Josh and I of the inhumane destruction during the testing program. And the forlorn, harrowing, kind of part-forgotten nature of this abandoned town seems such a potent symbol of a period of history that Russia itself has continually failed to acknowledge. So when we took a load of footage there, and then when we got back to the UK, we did some more research, and I spoke to a couple of charities that worked in the region, including the Greater Chernobyl Cause charity, which, kind of contrary to its name, also helps victims of Soviet nuclear testing in Kazakhstan. So it helps people with birth deformities or those suffering from cancers. And if any of you are interested, I really advise you to check out this charity because they're doing some really good work out there. So thank you for listening. This is the runway where the Soviet pilots would have taken off to go and drop their nuclear test bombs. And I'm now going to pass on to Josh, who's going to tell us a bit more about the history of the nuclear testing.
Cheers, thanks, Charles. Hello, everybody. I'm Josh, and I also did this trip and made this film with Charles. I hope you can now all see my screen. So I'm actually just going to run through sort of brief history of Soviet nuclear testing in Semipalatinsk, although Charles has touched on it. I thought it would be good to sort of get a sort of earlier history. So Charles has definitely touched on sort of what happened at the end and, you know, really the impacts that sort of seeing this abandoned town where the pilots took off had on us, and it was really, really impactful. But I'm actually just going to go back a little bit further and talk about some of the research, and just talk about the history from about 1949 when the nuclear testing began to be carried out in the Soviet Union, and Semi, as it is called now, but Semipalatinsk, the nearest city, as it was called in 1949, was selected as the testing ground for Soviet nuclear testing. Okay. So, yes, the first nuclear test in Soviet Russia, the USSR, was carried out on the 29th of August 1949, and the Soviets called this bomb the RDS-1, and the US named it Joe-1 in reference to Joseph Stalin. And actually, in the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were spies and were actually executed in 1951 for espionage in the United States, in New York, it was uncovered that RDS-1 was based on plans stolen from the US at the Los Alamos lab. So the Soviets had built this bomb, and the first test was carried out in August 1949, and that test was carried out at Semipalatinsk. So that first test, it actually yielded an explosion of 22 kilotons. Now that might sound, we might not know what that means, but actually it's larger, or just about the same, as the Fat Man bomb that the Americans dropped over Nagasaki to end, well, that some say hasten the end of the Second World War. So it's larger than Fat Man bomb, which was the larger of the two nuclear weapons that were used by the United States in the Second World War. It was larger than the biggest one. So it was an enormous explosion. And I'll just briefly talk about how the US actually discovered it. As Charles had mentioned in his presentation, to test the sort of effects, they actually brought the workers constructed houses, sort of fake houses. They actually constructed a bridge. They built a sort of a replica of a metro railway, sort of short line with a carriage relatively near the testing site in order to test the effectiveness of the bomb. And they also brought in, as the slide says, 1,500 animals. Some of the research I did, I found a quote from one of the scientists, and it said, the explosion actually caused more damage than expected. So they sort of had built this, for this test, they built this sort of fake city or town, and had dropped and exploded the bomb, and the effects, they said, were greater than expected. And I actually found that quote quite shocking, really, to be honest. And the other interesting thing was about how the US discovered it. So my next slide is going to be about why Semipalatinsk, but the US discovered it because they, the B-29 Superfortress, which I think is a later edition of the B-52 US aircraft, or an early edition, if they had fitted it out with as a weather plane, and it had flown across Kazakhstan on the day of testing on the 29th of August 1949, and the pilot had decided to fly into the cloud that was formed by the atomic explosion and collect, sort of atmospheric dust, so they could test what the cloud was. So they'd flown their plane into basically a cloud caused by an atomic bomb. Quite weird. So of the total nuclear tests carried out in the Soviet Union, there were 727, and a lot of the tests had more than one device fired. And in the world, most of the nuclear tests that have been carried out or were carried out before there was a ban on nuclear tests, and I believe that came into effect in the late 90s. Over 50% of the Soviet tests occurred at Semipalatinsk. So we wonder why Semipalatinsk was picked as the location for these nuclear tests. So effectively, Semipalatinsk is, there are a couple of slides here. It's quite, so there's Semipalatinsk, the red dot on the map, and there's where we are. And then there's within Kazakhstan, the red blob is the testing site, and Semi is just the nearest city, just there. So, you know, why was it selected as the Soviet testing site? So one, it was outside of sort of mainland Russia, would be one hypothesis. So you didn't have uproar or less political issues, less political pressure if it was carried out in the Kazakh USSR instead. Sorry, the Kazakh SSR instead of within sort of mainland Russia or whatever you'd like to call it. And the second reason was that it was sort of viewed as remote. The leader of the Soviet nuclear testing program at the time effectively claimed that this area of Kazakhstan was incredibly remote and uninhabited. Now, whether that's, I mean, that's not true, firstly, and it wasn't uninhabited in 1949. And I think there's also a case to be made that, you know, countries were looking for places within their territory that were remote in order for their tests not to be detected. Of course, that failed when the US picked up traces and flew into the ash cloud. But I think there's got to be a sense in which, you know, this quite remote area, quite far away from Europe to the and the main population areas, away from American allies. You know, if you're talking about an arms race with America, it might have been picked as a useful area to carry out the tests to avoid detection. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the health impacts on the locals, the local population near Semipalatinsk, and then Pete is actually going to talk about that in far more detail. So I'll try and not step on his toes or say anything incorrect, and I'm sure he will correct me later. But effectively, one of the largest studies of radiation exposure was carried out in Semipalatinsk of a population. So there was a study done in Cambridge, I believe, and it was a study of 19,545 inhabitants of Semi exposed or compromised or exposed to radiation or not exposed in the Semipalatinsk region. So they say that it comprises nearly 600,000 person years of follow-up health checks between 1960 and 1999. So it was an enormous study, and it did find some quite a lot of statistically significant results on you know, the mortality rate that Charles had touched on in the film. There was a significant increased chance of both lung and lymphatic cancers in the population, and breast cancer as well. So it's obviously had a massive impact, and this sort of huge study, you know, over 40 years or so, had really kind of shows the impacts, and I think people touch on that a bit.
That's really fascinating. I'm sure this is the kind of thing that Pete is going to touch on.
Yeah.
So it might be a good moment while we're kind of thinking about this to kind of bring Pete in, actually. So Pete, how does this kind of connect with your work? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just start off with a bit of an introduction. So my kind of background is radiation physics. I'm a physicist by background, and I've spent quite a lot of time working in the radiation safety field. And I'll just go through a bit of a presentation, kind of talking a bit about radiation risk and how it all kind of falls in line with the science. So hopefully you will all be able to see my screen in a second. Brilliant. So hopefully that's come up now. Right, okay. So as I said, today I'm here representing the Society for Radiological Protection. So we're the Royal Chartered professional body in the UK that governs the profession of radiation safety. And you might ask yourself, well, why am I here today in particular? What am I going to talk to you about? Well, ultimately, and I think we kind of see it in the film, which both Josh and Charles has put together, radiation can be a really emotive topic. It can be an area that people often get quite concerned of. And it's quite a complex area as well. So what I'm hoping to do in the next 5 to 10 minutes is just give you a brief overview of the science of radiation risk, and ultimately help you make your own informed decisions about what you think is a safe level of radiation, or whether you think radioactivity is something which is purely negative, or whether there's another side to it as well. And you might think, well, why do I need to talk about that? Why do I need to explore whether there are differing views around radiation? And so to start off with, I'm going to answer that in a very simple, interactive way. And as many of you as possible can answer that question, that'd be great, because there's going to be a few bits of interactive parts throughout the talk. So when any of you don't know the answer to something, how many of you do exactly what I do, which is just pick up your phone and Google the answer? Hopefully a poll will appear in a second, which will give you the ability to vote on that. So I think, that's a fair chunk of you. So about 90% of us all rely on a phone and the internet to check the sources of information and find out the answer to something. And that really highlights the problem here, the source of why there's confusion. If you were to go into Google and you were to just search something like Chernobyl and biodiversity or environmental impacts, then you're going to get 2 articles that come up really easy. There's one here by the BBC, and there's one here by the Telegraph. And they're saying completely opposite things. So the BBC article is talking about the Chernobyl zone showing a decline in biodiversity, and the one by the Telegraph is saying 30 years after the Chernobyl disaster, wildlife is flourishing in a radioactive wasteland. Now, they're both saying contradictory statements. And actually, in this case here, the Telegraph article is actually more correct in what it's stating, because Chernobyl actually is one of the most biodiverse places you can actually visit in the world at the moment, and that's purely because the real destroyer isn't there, which is humans. And so it's really important that we understand when we see all this information online, we have to take it in context. And it's really important to understand that there is misinformation out there, and it's important to take a balanced view on what the real truth is. And that's what I want to talk a bit about in the next few slides. So I apologize, but the next slide is the only bit of physics that you'll see in this talk. I'm going to try and keep this quite high level. So when I'm talking about radioactivity, I talk about radiation, there's often confusion. People think radiation is anything from your microwave, links to your mobile phone, to linking to nuclear power, to linking to atomic testing. Now, often what we're talking about when we refer to the atomic bomb, or we talk about nuclear power or medical X-rays, we're talking about a type of radiation called ionizing radiation. And what that is it's a type of radiation which is really energetic. So there's a lot of energy associated with it. In fact, there's so much energy in the radiation that it can interact with an atom, with the atoms that make up substances, and knock out an electron. And so what that means is that the atom becomes positively charged and you have free electrons in the material. And if that happens in the human body, that can lead to some real complications at a cellular level. And so all you need to take away from it is ionizing radiation is really energetic. And it's so energetic, it can interact and with atoms and ultimately change their charge. And to really kind of try and put that into a bit of context, I said I was going to keep this fairly interactive, and I'm going to try and keep that going. I'm going to put some images up on the screen, and a poll is going to start. And I want you to click on as many items in that poll as possible that you think is either uses radioactivity, it is radioactive itself, or produces some form of radioactive waste or byproduct. And so you should hopefully have a poll in front of you now, and it's giving you the option to pick between whether you think radiation is used in medical treatments, whether it's used in producing nuclear power, atomic bombs, building materials in your home, the food and drinks you consume, coal-fired power stations, solar panels, wind turbines. Tick as many boxes as you like. I want to just try and see what everyone's general view is around what items, which of the following are either use radioactivity or produce radioactive byproducts or waste. Okay, hopefully the answers will be there. Right, so not surprisingly, everyone's gone. Medical, X-rays, absolutely involve the use of ionizing radiation, or if you look at certain types of diagnostic cancer and cancer treatments, they also use radioactivity in them as well. Nuclear power, absolutely, it produces radioactive waste, but it also uses radioactive material as well, atomic bombs. Right, so those are obvious ones. I expected everyone to say yes, uses radioactivity. But actually the answer is every single item on that list. So radiation is actually all around you. It's part of your everyday life. It occurs naturally in the air that we breathe, to the rocks beneath us. It comes from outer space. It's literally everywhere. So the building materials in your house will contain levels of natural radioactivity. The food that we eat and drink also contains natural radioactivity. Bananas are often used as an example of a source of radioactivity in your food. Coffee as well. If you're a fan of coffee, it has a bit of potassium-40 and also polonium in it. So it's also a source of radioactivity. And what's really interesting is coal-fired power stations, they discharge radioactivity into the environment. Solar panels and wind turbines all produce radioactive waste. So it's not just nuclear power that's alone in there. So key point I want you to take away from that slide is radiation is part of your day-to-day life. You can't escape it. There's literally no escaping it. And as such, you shouldn't necessarily fear it just because you hear the word radioactivity. But it really raises another question we need to consider, which is what level is a safe level of radiation? When do you need to be worried and when do you not need to be worried? And to do that, we need to really introduce this concept of dose. Now, dose is a measure of radiation exposure, and it's a measure of health effect. So this is the way we look at whether there is a health effect, is we use this term dose, and it's measured in a unit called a millisievert. A millisievert's quite a small unit in itself. Now, what do we know from the science? Now, Josh actually alluded to this. There's a lot of data around radiation health effects. In fact, we have probably more data on radiation health effects than we do most chemicals out there. And that's because there's been a lot of sources of data, and it's very easy to measure, and we encounter it in so much of our life anyway. And so based on a large quantity of data from the atomic tests, from Chernobyl, from medical exposures, from those that work in fields involved with radiation, we have a really good understanding of the health effects. And in particular, we divide the health effects into two different parts. The first part is what we call deterministic health effects. And what I mean by that is we know that at very high levels of exposure of radiation, so 1,000 millisieverts plus, you will see a definitive health effect. So you would definitely see a health effect. And that can be things such as radiation poisoning, which for those of you that might have watched the Chernobyl documentary would have seen some of the images and examples of that. So high exposures, definitely going to be a health effect. But we also know that for anything above 100 millisieverts, there is evidence of an increasing cancer risk as well. And that roughly goes up at about 5% per 1,000 millisieverts. So don't worry, I'm not going to test you on the numbers. What you need to know is really high exposures, definite health effect. And anything above 100, there's an increased chance of seeing something such as a cancer, but it's roughly 5% per 1,000 millisieverts. What's really important to understand about that, though, is that below 100 millisieverts, there's actually no scientific evidence of a health effect or increased cancer risk associated with radiation. However, you'll notice that I've got a second image there, which is a graph with a dotted line all the way going to 0. So we assume that there could be, but in reality, there's no scientific evidence to suggest there's an increased cancer risk at low levels of radiation exposure. But I just want to put this into a bit of context. Know why this is almost over. All the science is almost over. And so what I've done here is I've plotted a couple of different values in millisieverts, a couple of doses in millisieverts to give you an idea of context. So basically, above 1,000, as I said, anything above 1,000, you start seeing radiation sickness. And at really high levels, roughly about 6,000 millisieverts, people die. And those are the types of exposures that we saw in the likes of Chernobyl, with the liquidators directly involved in trying to to deal with the exposed nuclear core. So thousands of millisieverts, definitively, you're going to get serious health effects, and as high as 6,000, and you could be talking about death. What you know there is then also 100 millisieverts. So I said it's the lower level linked to increased cancer risk. That's the lowest level we've seen any scientific data of an increase in cancer risk. But I mentioned that radioactivity is all around you. It's part of your day-to-day life. In the UK, on average, we get 2.7 millisieverts per year. So every year, we're exposed to 2.7 millisieverts per year of radiation exposure by natural radioactivity around you, from medical exposures, and from all those sources. Now, 2.7 millisieverts doesn't sound like a huge amount, really. And it's probably worth noting that that's an average background exposure for someone in the UK. Whereas in reality, there are parts of the UK it can be as high as 27 millisieverts your background radiation is, or much lower than 2.7. It varies depending where you are, but on average, it's 2.7 millisieverts per year. A couple of other two important things to note is that because radioactivity is all around you, we actually have a threshold of no regulatory concern. So that's a threshold below which, in legal terms, something isn't radioactive. So if it gives you a dose of 0.01 millisieverts per year, it's not radioactive by law. And that's the threshold of no regulatory concern. And that's just a bit of a context. So I'm going to put up another poll now, and there's quite a bit for you to consider, but I want you to look at different scenarios and think where it fits on this scale. So the first one will be, where on the scale do you think living next to a nuclear power station would sit? What kind of exposures would you get from living next to a nuclear power station? And then the second thing I'll ask you to consider is where you think on that scale an individual working in a nuclear power station would sit. And then we'll look at also where on a scale would an individual working in the solar panel industry, and I mean the broadest side of the solar panel industry, so everything from the mining and processing of the materials for solar panels all the way through to installing solar panels. And then lastly, which is most relevant to our talk, where do you think the local inhabitants sat, the ones who are watching the weapons testing in places like Chagan? Where did they sit on this scale? Where do you think and this is literally those watching the testing, so those directly near it, where do you think they sit? So just take a bit of time to think where you want to guess. It's just a bit of a guessing exercise, and then we'll talk about what the answers are, or what the science currently says about the answers. Okay, so in terms of where nuclear power station sits, living next to one, most people said it was less than 1. You're right, it is less than 1. It's in fact less than 0.01. So it's roughly there. In fact, living next to a nuclear power station, it's not much of an issue. It's actually really low levels of radiation exposure. It blends into actually even being below a level which is below a threshold of regulatory concerns. Most modern nuclear power stations are below 0.01. In terms of where does an individual working on a nuclear power station sit, less than 20. It's good to see lots of people saying less than 20, because 20 is the dose limit. So that's the limit by which, that's the legal limit you should not exceed if you're someone working with radiation. In reality, though, you should never be getting close to 20. And most people working in the nuclear industry don't actually get close to 20. They stay less than 1. So it's if you look at the fact that the annual background dose is 2.7 millisieverts, so someone working in the nuclear industry might get 3.7 millisieverts, but in reality, they'll even be less than that. I mean, in most cases, it's only around half a millisievert. And where does someone sitting in the solar panel industry sit? Everyone said less than 20. Interesting. Yes, it is less than 20, but it's higher than someone working in the nuclear industry. In fact, on average, someone working in the solar panel sector will get about 40 times the radiation exposure of someone working in the nuclear sector. And that's due to the mining of the materials and the processing of the materials used in solar panels, but that results in a higher level of radiation exposure. And then more interestingly, where did the people sit who were watching the atomic tests during the 50s and 60s? And it's no surprise, actually, it's the second most popular answer. It was just under 700, and I mean, it is just under 700. So most of the scientific studies that were done, or what we know from a limited data there is, and I think the key point to get here is there is, although there were some measurements and experiments done, the actual science and amount of published information around the exact exposures is very limited. But the latest studies have estimated it's probably around about 600 millisieverts to those individuals who were directly watching the tests or near to watching the tests for local inhabitants in the surrounding areas. So that helps us put things into a bit of context. It means that, you know, they're definitely above a level where there could be, science would say, some increase in cancer risk. But what's really important to note there is those were the ones who were close to the testing. So that doesn't mean if you go and live in somewhere in that region now, you're going to get those types of exposures. In fact, the amount of radioactivity left in the soil and the surrounding areas only adds about 0.045 millisieverts extra per year. It's not a huge amount of additional exposure you get from living there now. The key thing is watching the testings back then led to a much higher level of exposure because you directly got the irradiation from the atomic bomb and the actual blast itself. That's what caused the predominant radiation exposure. But what the studies have also shown, which is really interesting, is what's becoming more of an issue than the radiation health effects, the potential increase in cancer risk, is the psychological effect. And so that stress and that fear and that trauma from maybe watching the tests or from fearing the radiation and the radiation health effects is causing much more psychological damage than the actual health effects associated with the radiation itself. And that's quite interesting and quite an important perception to look at in this context. And just going on to my last slide, to really help answer the question, I've gone through a lot of things there in terms of different levels of radiation. But what's really important here is to understand, how do we make a decision about what is an acceptable level of exposure? Because I even talked about the levels of exposure now in that area are relatively low. You know, the levels of exposure in terms of someone getting exposed from working in the solar panel industry compared to the nuclear industry is quite different. How do they determine what's acceptable? Why is it acceptable in one industry for one thing and acceptable for another reason in another industry? And so the principles of radiation safety and radiation protection, we base it on 3 core principles. The first thing we ask ourselves is the exposure justified? Is there a net benefit to the exposure? I'll give you an example. If you go into a hospital to get an x-ray because you might have broken a bone, the small amount of radiation exposure compared to the benefit of being able to see whether you've broken the bone, there's a clear net benefit. There is a clear net benefit. So that would be a justified exposure. Is it justified, though, in the case of these atomic testing? That's the first thing we'd need to ask ourselves. If it was justified, then you need to look at, has the exposures been optimized? And by that, I mean, in radiation safety, we look at, can we reduce the number of people being exposed, the likelihood of an exposure, or the level of exposure to as low as reasonably achievable, taking social and economic factors into account. And so what we mean by that is we balance the level of exposure and the likelihood of exposure, the number of people being exposed, against the cost of reducing that exposure, the societal impacts of reducing that exposure, and also the other factors such as the benefits and the reason behind it as well. And that's how we look at what is an optimized level. So it's not about reducing it, it's about optimizing it. And then lastly, it must be below the legal dose limits. And so if you remember in my previous slide, the legal dose limit for someone working with radiation was 20. And for someone who was a member of the public, it's about 1. So it's 1 additional to your background exposure. And so if we apply this logic to the atomic testing, was it justified to expose those watching the test to those very high levels of radiation exposure, 600 millisieverts plus? Probably it was not justified, I think it's fair to say. It's an unjustifiable exposure. It's definitely above dose limits. There's definitely no sign of being optimized. I mean, the key thing you have to remember, though, is these principles we use now and the science behind our understanding of radiation health effects is much better now than it ever was in the 50s and 60s. At those times, we were still learning and understanding radiation health effects. So that's part of what would have come into play here. So it definitely wouldn't be justifiable today, is probably all I can say on that point. And then just to conclude, I mean, I hope that's been informative. I hope I've tried to cover a lot in a short period of time. I hope that's given you some kind of insight into the science behind radiation risk. And what I leave you with is just a simple concluding remark, which is ultimately only you can decide what level of radiation risk is safe, because it's just personal decision, it's emotional decision that you'll have tied to your own interpretation. But it's important to base that decision on the science as a good part of that as well. I hope that's been interesting. Happy to take any questions, but also I'll hand back over to Dane.
Thanks so much. That was a really interesting review of some of the scientific factors that you're looking into in terms of safety. I remember having a conversation with someone at the University of Bristol a little while ago on the sort of safety of nuclear energy sites and coal power stations particularly. And it was a similar sort of response to the solar power example that you used, is that a lot of coal deposits are co-deposited with highly radioactive materials. So actually it's more dangerous actually living by a coal powered station for all sorts of reasons, including sort of ionizing radiation kind of emissions in the ambient environment, but the protections just aren't there. Whereas in contrast with a nuclear power station, the regulatory protections are all there. So it's just really interesting to kind of see what is visible and also non-visible in the kind of in the public and sort of regulatory kind of space.
Completely.
So there's a question that's kind of in the box, and I think we might kind of come to these questions later on. But I think it's just really interesting just to return to the film for a second with Josh and Charles. So the journey that you went on, honestly, what a palaver. It's almost difficult to believe some of those things that you had photographic evidence for had happened. I remember traveling across Russia, many years ago on the train, and had similar sorts of kind of chaotic experiences with kind of, circumstances that you are presented with. As a group of, was it 5 of you? As a group of
4 of us, 4
of you, kind of wanting to kind of make a film. I'm really curious to know, did any one of you speak any kind of Russian or read Cyrillic or?
No, and it was funny. We downloaded the Russian dictionary on Google Translate on our phones, and now if we go through our phones, like on the app, the Google Translate app, we've got the most hilarious kind of extensive translated messages about various things that were wrong with the car, trying to explain it to kind of Kazakhstani mechanics and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean it's funny, but no.
And also kind of gaining access to these sort of places and sort of finding your way around. Was anyone there to kind of help you kind of, or were you getting all the information from the kind of guidebooks and online resources?
Not really. I mean, a lot of the brutalist sites that we went to were quite well-known buildings, so we were able to film there quite easily. But with Chagan, for example, no one was there when we got there, basically. So we were on our own a bit. Okay.
And then Josh, just thinking about your undergraduate studies of politics and economics, how much of that prepared you for this outcome and the trip in itself, would you say?
Interestingly, I'd actually been to Central Asia, that part of the trip before, but we actually travelled through quite a few authoritarian states. So, for example, Turkmenistan, which is on that route that we took, and we briefly entered it on a very short visa, 3-day visa, is the second most suppressive state in the world, bar North Korea. And a lot of those states sort of around that area are really, they're quite authoritarian, and they're sort of propped up by huge oil rents that allow them to placate the population. That would be one theory anyway. But yeah, they have enormous amounts of oil wealth that is then transported to Russia on sort of enormous, and Kazakhstan's in that boat as well. So it's a very interesting part of the world.
Okay, interesting. And then just there's a question in the question box here that's wanting to know a little bit about the kind of population in the area. Do you have a feeling for how many people? I mean, I don't think I saw it in the film, but do you have a feeling of the number of people that lived in the vicinity of the test zone before the detonation?
I'm not sure actually how many people were living in that area. I know that now Semi is a city of 300,000 people, but I don't know how many were living in the area. I mean, it was relatively rural. It wasn't like they were dropping on.
It was tens of thousands, I think, from the research I've done.
Yeah. But still, lots of people, but not the population of a major city.
Yeah.
And then, do you have any feeling, or maybe this is a question for Pete to kind of comment as well, perhaps, is any feeling of or indication of the sort of contamination of the ground and any implications into sort of farming and sort of flow of water or other kind of contamination that's moving away from the kind of original test area?
So I think it's fair to say that there will be some residual contamination. That's kind of unavoidable in itself. So if you imagine when the testing happened, obviously it would have detonated and spread radioactive material over quite a large vicinity. And that will deposit onto the ground and be taken up by plants, etc. So there have been some scientific studies that have been done on this, and they have looked at certain levels of radionuclides that could be found, cesium, alpha-emitting radionuclides as well, such as plutonium. There will be trace quantities around. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a very, very high level of radiation exposure there. It does mean, though, that there's natural radioactivity as well. There will be some of these naturals as well, man-made radionuclides as well. You probably wouldn't want to farm there anyway, just because there could be a chance you could uptake some of that contamination. I think you would take a logic about, would you farm there or would you farm somewhere else? And it comes back to that logic: is it a justifiable exposure if it can be avoided? And I think that's not to say people don't grow crops there and don't ingest part of it. So when I looked at the studies that were done, and I quoted that 0.045 millisieverts per year for someone living there now, that did take into account a proportion of their time they would eat local produce, which would be contaminated. So it's not looking at huge exposures at the moment in terms of if you were to farm there, but it's probably still not sensible to do it if you could avoid it.
So why would you if you didn't have to, is the answer. Okay, thank you. And then there's a question in the box here, just curious to know how many millisieverts the four of you were exposed to. And based on Pete's answer, I'm assuming not very many if you were not there for very long. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we didn't take a counter with us, but the fact that we're allowed to enter this area without a guide compared to the actual centre of the test zone implies that it wasn't particularly risky.
So the centre of the test zone, which was not the area which we visited just basically the town where the pilots lived. The centre of the test zone, you can't go in without a guide. And actually, even though the radiation, as Pete says, is not actually very high, the locals who we spoke to said, why would you want to go there? We wouldn't. We would never go there.
Part of this is probably, as Pete was saying, that fear that we definitely still felt of radioactivity in the region. So yeah.
Okay. And someone has posted in the chat box here an article from New Scientist that I hope just wasn't the result of a random Google search, is that there are some radiation-eating bacteria that can find a way to, I'm not sure, I can't read it all, but find a way to help with making nuclear waste a bit safer. So maybe Pete is aware of this radiation-eating bacteria. Are you familiar with this, Pete?
Not something necessarily I've done a lot of. I've heard something about this before, though.
I mean, I guess I would imagine it's bioaccumulation. Rather, I mean, you can't obviously just stop. You can't consume these things and break it down into safe material. So I'd imagine if there is radioisotopic kind of fragments around and bacteria consuming them, I would imagine.
I mean, it is obviously possible to decontaminate areas and clean up areas. I mean, a great example of this, if you look at scenarios where we've seen radiation contamination in the environment, Chernobyl was a prime example, so is Fukushima. And they're very different examples. If you look at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, then there was an exclusion zone there, but most people don't realize the exclusion zone has just continued to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink as they've cleaned up more and more of the areas. In fact, they've cleaned it up to such a degree, it's probably less radioactive than when it started from the natural radiation, because they set themselves such a tight threshold to clean it down to. So I mean, it's an example of you can clean these things up if you want to. But then saying that, I'd talk about the net benefit of the fact Chernobyl, to an extent, has been left the way it has allowed the biodiversity to come back, which if you watch the David Attenborough recent documentary, he starts off actually in Pripyat in Chernobyl and ends by saying this is now one of the most biodiverse areas. It's quite an interesting scenario there.
Okay, and there's a pair of questions here that is around the sort of societal kind of exposure to sort of radiation risk. Is that, I guess it's two separate questions, but they kind of fit together, I think. Do people who live in sort of radiation or areas of high radiation, do they always understand the kind of level of radiation that's in the environment? And then the second one is that someone is struggling to reconcile the fact that if exposure from Chagan was under 700 millisieverts, why are there so many babies born with congenital birth defects?
So I'll take the first question first, which was obviously about, do people understand radiation risk around them? Often no. I mean, I think it's something that as a profession and as a scientist, we need to do better. We need to be able to communicate to the public, but it has to be in a readily understandable way. You know, if I went up there and I spoke about radiation science in infinite detail, it would confuse anyone. So it has to be the right level of communication. And that's something we need to do across, I think, science in general. It's not just about radiation risk. 5G is another prime example, which had a lot of concern recently. As scientists, we need to be communicating best to people and have that open and trusted dialogue so we can all understand better. And in terms of the other question around the under 700 millisieverts versus the increase in potential deformities, I think what's really important here, and this is something we all struggle with in science, in epidemiology, and by that I mean, if you look at the amount of things you're surrounded by on a day-to-day basis, which could contribute to deformities or cancer risk, just look at the fact of smoking, we talk about carcinogens that we eat, it's very difficult to understand what's the base case, so what's the original rates of deformities and cancer increases versus the increase if you expose them to a certain types of stimulus like radiation or smoking. And so you can't say that it's definitively radiation causing those deformities. Yes, we know that based on the large amount of data we have, there is an increase in cancer risk and genetic effects at roughly 5% per 1,000. So we know that this is in the territory that there would have been some increase, but it's probably much lower than people are associating it with compared to the general deformities that are happening. There'll always be a level of cancer in a population, regardless of radiation being elevated or not. And there will always be some levels of deformities and being there as well. So it's understanding what you're comparing and whether you're truly comparing the right things. But based on the science, and as I said it before, we have more data on radiation than most chemicals and other health effects to inform that view.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose it's the same thing that even for instance, with the current COVID pandemic, there's the kind of notion of correlation and causation. And so people might be thinking about, for instance, obesity and, you know, more sort of complications because of COVID, or even age as a complicating factor. It's more complicated, isn't it, than just saying this will cause that. Absolutely. It might be kind of, you know, it might be a kind of co-symptom or kind of a contributing factor, but it might not be the actual thing that kind of causes the tipping point, for instance. That's what you're saying. So there are a number of factors at play. Absolutely. And we don't always understand what they are. And, you know, in terms of the, you know, was it brave of these 4 young guys to kind of drive around the former USSR and take a video? We wouldn't have been talking about this tonight without that happening. And sure, there might have been a bit of danger, but it turns out the most obvious danger they experienced was a car crash, you know, so and you couldn't have predicted that. So there are some things that we can mitigate in our lives, but there are some things that unfortunately, you know, you might just get knocked down by a bus, I'm afraid. So you can be as cautious as you like, but there are some things that are just going to blindside you, and we can mitigate and minimize those unhelpful and problematic factors. That's probably the best we can do. There is one final question that I'd just like to ask, and this is to Pete. How can people join the Society of Radiation Protection?
So first of all, anyone can join. So we have different grades of membership. Some of them are professional memberships for those who work in the field. If you're a student, it's free. And if you're just a member of the public who's got a general interest, there's an open grade of membership you can sign up to as well. So just go to the Society for Radiological Protection website. You can Google it, it will come up. And you can, which has information there on how to join it, which is great to hear that people are asking that question.
Well, people want to know, people want to find out, and they're curious. And that's the great thing about the audience that comes to these events, is that they're curious and inquiring. So I think on that note, there's one last question has just come through the box. Oh yes, okay. So is there a remediation strategy for Chagan, or the possibility of decreasing the area of the exclusion zone for people who might be visiting the area with no patrols or guides? Do we know what's going to happen about Chagan in the future, or what the status is?
I'm not familiar, but Josh and,
so my understanding actually was that you can go currently into the exclusion zone without a guide. It's just very not a good idea in terms of what the locals say. People disagree. And in terms of the actual radiation is still there, effectively in 1990 the site was abandoned, but over 15 years Kazakhstani, Russian and US scientists have basically locked up all that radiation, so it's actually quite safe. So I think it's sort of been dealt with.
That's good to know. And that's a good end point. Thanks, guys, for making the film. Really thought-provoking, really inspirational conversation that we've just had. Thanks, Pete, for joining us, and thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.